In 1944, the future of warfare arrived without warning. The German Me-262 jet was a technological marvel, a machine so far ahead of its time, it rendered the entire Allied air fleet obsolete in an instant. It was a predator, untouchable at high altitude. But what German engineering achieved in the stratosphere, it sacrificed on the runway. The most advanced weapon of the war had a primitive flaw, an Achilles heel that turned its nest into a shooting gallery for the very propeller planes it was designed to slaughter. For the Allied bomber crews and their fighter escorts, the summer of 1944 introduced a terrifying new variable into the calculus of survival over the Reich. It began as whispers, then as panicked reports over the radio from pilots whose voices were tight with disbelief. A silver shape, moving with an unnatural velocity, with no propeller disc blurring its nose, only a searing alien hiss. For a pilot in a P-51 Mustang, a man who had mastered the intricate dance of energy fighting where altitude and speed were currency traded in seconds. The Messerschmitt 262 was an apparition. It did not obey the known physics of air combat. The speed differential was not just a tactical advantage, it was a fundamental shattering of aerial doctrine. The jet was over 100 miles per hour faster than the swiftest Mustang, an eternity in a dogfight. It could accelerate in a climb, a feat that seemed to defy gravity itself. The established rules of engagement, honed over 5 brutal years of war, became instantly irrelevant. The mission of the escort fighter was to form a protective shield around the vulnerable B-17 flying fortresses, to meet the enemy and destroy him before he could bring his guns to bear on the heavy bombers. But the Me-262 refused this duel. It would appear from high above, a mere glint in the sun, and then descend like a thunderbolt, ignoring the escorts as if they were tethered in place. Its armament of 4 30mm cannons was not designed for dogfighting. It was designed for demolition. A single, well-placed burst could sever the wing from a B-17, turning the 10-man bomber into a vortex of fire and falling debris in a heartbeat. The jets would execute one devastating pass and then vanish, using their incredible speed to climb away, untouchable, leaving a trail of black smoke and parachutes against the cold blue sky. Allied command at High Wycombe watched the bomber loss rates begin to tick upwards with alarm. The entire strategic bombing campaign, the relentless aerial assault designed to cripple Germany's industrial heart, was predicated on the ability of the 8th Air Force to defend its bombers. If this new jet threat was allowed to grow unchecked, the air war over Europe, and perhaps the ground war that depended on it, could falter. The Allies were winning the war, but they were suddenly facing a technological checkmate in the skies. But within this revolutionary design, a fatal compromise had been made. The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines, the source of the 262's power, were primitive and temperamental beasts. They were incredibly fragile, with a service life of barely a dozen hours before needing a complete overhaul or replacement. More critically for the pilot, they suffered from a dangerously slow throttle response. A Mustang pilot could slam his throttle forward and get an instantaneous surge of power from his Merlin engine. A jet pilot had to gently, painstakingly nurse the throttle, waiting precious, agonizing seconds for the turbine to spool up. Pushing it too hard would flood the engine with fuel, causing it to overheat and burst into flames on the wing. This lack of agility was compounded by the jet's wing design. The swept wings that gave the 262 its phenomenal high-speed performance were a liability at low speeds. During the long, shallow, and terrifyingly fast approach required for a landing, the aircraft became sluggish and prone to stalling. The pilot was no longer a hunter. He was a passenger, focused entirely on coaxing his futuristic machine onto a narrow strip of concrete. He was low, he was slow, and his path was utterly, fatally predictable. This fatal window of vulnerability did not go unnoticed. In the debriefing rooms of fighter groups across England, a new and dangerous picture was slowly coming into focus. Pilots like Chuck Yeager, men who lived and breathed aerial combat, were frustrated. Their instincts, their training, their magnificent P-51 Mustangs, all were rendered almost useless against an enemy that refused a fair fight. But as more encounters were logged, a pattern began to emerge, a glimmer of hope in the mounting casualty reports. Pilots reported seeing the jets only in specific corridors of the sky, corridors that invariably led back to a handful of heavily defended airfields. It was men like Lieutenant Richard Connor of the 357th Fighter Group who began to connect the dots. In December of 1944, he and his squadron mates consistently observed the jets appearing and disappearing in the vicinity of their bases, like hornets tethered to a nest. The conclusion was as simple as it was revolutionary. If you can't kill the hornet in the air, you go and burn the nest. This realization marked a profound tactical shift, a move from reactive defense to proactive, predatory hunting. A new, unofficial doctrine began to circulate, passed from pilot to pilot in hushed tones. It was given a grimly appropriate name: rat catching. The strategy was a brutal inversion of traditional air combat. Instead of escorting bombers and waiting for the attack, squadrons of Mustangs would now deliberately venture deep into Germany with a singular mission: to find the lairs of the Me-262. They would arrive over known jet bases like Akmer or Rheinhopsten and climb to high altitude, circling like hawks, often using cloud cover to mask their presence. From this perch, they would patiently watch and wait. The hunt required a new kind of discipline. It was an exercise in pure, cold-blooded patience, punctuated by moments of extreme violence. For the German jet pilot, the ordeal of landing his advanced machine was already a trial of immense concentration. He was managing his delicate throttles, fighting the sluggish controls, his eyes fixed on the runway stretching before him. He was at his lowest energy state, utterly committed to his final approach. It was in these final, vulnerable seconds that the trap would be sprung. The watching Mustang pilots would see their chance and roll their aircraft over, plunging down from 20,000 feet in a silent, deadly dive. For the German pilot, the first sign of doom would be the glint of sun on a silver wing, or more likely, the sudden, violent hammering of 50 caliber machine gun rounds ripping through his fuselage. There was no time to react, no possibility of escape. A machine capable of over 500 miles per hour in level flight was now a helpless target, unable to accelerate or maneuver, caught in the open just feet above the ground. The result was a spectacularly one-sided slaughter. But this was no easy turkey shoot. The Germans were keenly aware of this vulnerability. Their jet airfields were among the most heavily defended locations on Earth, bristling with hundreds of anti-aircraft, or flak, guns of all calibers. For a Mustang pilot diving on a landing jet, the attack run meant flying directly into a dense, terrifying curtain of exploding shells. The sky would turn black with flak bursts, each puff of smoke representing a cloud of lethal metal shards. The pilot had to fly a perfect attack run, score a kill, and escape through this maelstrom, all while dodging the conventional propeller fighters, often Focke-Wulf 190Ds that were scrambled specifically to provide air cover for the landing jets. Rat catching was a high-stakes, high-risk gamble, trading the lives of skilled American pilots for the jets that threatened the entire bombing campaign. Initially, Allied High Command at High Wycombe was deeply skeptical of this new tactic. The established doctrine was clear. A fighter's primary job was to protect the bombers. Deliberately sending valuable pilots and their P-51s on missions to orbit heavily defended enemy airfields seemed like a reckless squandering of resources. The losses began to mount almost immediately. Mustang groups returned to base with empty slots in their formations. Their pilots lost not to enemy fighters, but to the anonymous, indiscriminate fury of German flak. The debate in the halls of power was intense. On one side were the pragmatists, arguing that the cost in pilots and planes was too high for a strategy that seemed, on the surface, to be a deviation from the primary mission. On the other side were the forward-thinking commanders and the pilots themselves, who saw the grim reality firsthand. They argued that every Me-262 destroyed on the ground or during its landing approach was one less jet that would be preying on the B-17 formations a few days later. The losses from rat catching, they contended, had to be weighed against the catastrophic potential losses in the bomber streams if the jet fleet was allowed to become fully operational. The tipping point came in the winter of 1944 and early 1945. The Me-262 force, despite its teething problems, was growing in number and effectiveness. Bomber crews were reporting more and more encounters, and the psychological impact was devastating. The sight of a jet slicing through their formation, untouchable and lethal, was a blow to morale that was as damaging as the physical losses. The jets represented a technological trump card, a weapon that seemed to make the courage and skill of the bomber crews tragically irrelevant. It was a crisis that demanded a decisive answer. That answer came from General Carl Spaatz, the commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe. He was a man who understood the brutal arithmetic of the air war. He saw the rising bomber casualty figures and recognized the existential threat the jets posed to his entire campaign. The strategy of systematically dismantling Germany's war machine from the air was in jeopardy. On February 27, 1945, the informal, pilot-led tactic of rat catching was given official sanction. The High Command issued a directive that made the destruction of the German jet force a top priority, second only to the direct protection of the bombers. This order was a seismic shift. It unleashed the full might of the 8th and 9th Air Forces against the jet threat. It was a green light for men like Major Donald Bach of the 353rd Fighter Group, who became a master of this deadly new art form. He and pilots like him were now officially licensed hunters, their prey the most advanced aircraft in the world. Their hunting grounds were the flak-saturated skies over places like Lechfeld and Münchenrhein. The directive was an admission that the only way to kill the future was to ambush it at its nest, no matter the cost. The floodgates were open, and the systematic campaign to neutralize the Me-262 had begun in earnest. From this point forward, no German jet pilot could feel safe, even in sight of his own runway. The hunters were coming for them, and they would be waiting. With the official authorization, the rat-catching missions evolved from a risky ad hoc tactic into a refined and systematic military operation. March and April of 1945 became the peak of this deadly hunt. American fighter groups developed intricate strategies to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing their exposure to the ever-present flak. They learned to approach the target airfields from different altitudes and directions, using the sun and cloud cover to their advantage. Some groups would act as high-altitude bait, hoping to draw up the conventional, propeller-driven Focke-Wulf 190 escorts, while another group of Mustangs would lie in wait, ready to pounce on the jets as they returned to land. Communication and coordination were key. Pilots became experts at identifying the specific landmarks that guided German jet pilots back to their hidden airfields. They memorized the patterns of rivers, forests, and railway lines, using the enemy's own navigation aids against them. The psychological pressure on the German jet pilots became immense. A successful combat sortie against a formation of B-17s was an exercise in high-speed, high-G combat. But the return to base was a descent into a new kind of hell. Exhausted from their mission, low on fuel and nursing their delicate engines, they now faced the harrowing final gauntlet. The last few miles of their flight, the approach over their own field, became the most dangerous part of any mission. They were hunted where they should have been safest. The German response was to create a desperate fortress around their jet bases. They concentrated their most experienced flak crews and heaviest anti-aircraft batteries, creating what the Allied pilots called flak alleys, corridors of airspace so saturated with explosives that survival seemed a matter of pure luck. To further protect their prized jets, the Luftwaffe formed special protection squadrons, or Platzschutzstaffeln, often equipped with the formidable Focke-Wulf 190 D9 Dora. These elite pilots had one job: to circle the airfield and protect the vulnerable jets during their takeoff and landing phases. This led to frantic, swirling dogfights at low altitude, a chaotic melee of Mustangs, Doras, and flak, all centered on the helpless Me-262 attempting to touch down. It was some of the most complex and dangerous aerial combat of the entire war. The personal accounts of the rat catchers speak of a surreal and terrifying experience. They describe diving through a thick black cloud of their own making. The smoke from the flak burst so dense it blotted out the sun. They flew with one eye on their target and the other scanning for the muzzle flashes of the 88mm guns on the ground. A leading figure in this specialized form of warfare was Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most celebrated aces. In the final, desperate months of the war, he commanded an elite unit of jet aces, known as Jagdverband 44, or JV-44. Flying out of Munkenreem, his squadron of experts inflicted serious damage on Allied bomber formations, but even they were not immune to the relentless pressure of the rat catchers. Landing for Galland's aces was a nerve-shredding ordeal. They knew that somewhere above the clouds, a flight of Mustangs was likely circling, patiently waiting for them to lower their landing gear and commit to the final approach. The hunter had truly become the hunted. The rat-catching campaign was one crucial prong of a multifaceted assault designed to break the back of the Luftwaffe's jet force. While the P-51s were ambushing the Me-262s in the air, the heavy bombers they were protecting were systematically erasing their infrastructure on the ground. The strategic bombing campaign, now shielded by these aggressive fighter tactics, turned its full attention to the known jet airfields, manufacturing plants, and, most critically, Germany's fuel supply. This created a strategic vice that was slowly crushing the life out of the jet program. And Me-262 on the ground with no fuel was just as useless as one shot down on approach. By the spring of 1945, the fuel crisis in Germany had become catastrophic. The relentless bombing of synthetic oil refineries meant that even when brand new jets were available, There was often no kerosene to fly them. Training for new pilots was drastically curtailed, meaning that the few who did take to the skies were often inexperienced, making them even more vulnerable to the seasoned American veterans waiting for them. The impact of the rat-catching tactics went far beyond the simple tally of jets destroyed. The constant threat created a state of siege, forcing the Luftwaffe to disperse its jet squadrons to smaller, less equipped, and often improvised airfields. Sometimes, this meant operating from sections of the Autobahn. While this dispersal made them harder to target for large-scale bombing raids, it created a logistical nightmare. Maintenance became nearly impossible. Rearming was slow, and coordination was a chaotic mess. A technologically superior weapon system was being dismantled not by a superior technology, but by a superior strategy that targeted its weakest links, its reliance on long, prepared runways, and its thirst for a fuel that no longer existed. The effect on the morale of the German jet pilots was corrosive. These men were the elite of the Luftwaffe, flying a machine that they knew was the best in the world. They could dominate the skies at 30,000 feet, yet they were being picked off like beginners just yards from their home base. They were dying in a way that felt dishonorable, shot down not in a noble duel between knights of the air, but ambushed at their most helpless moment. The psychological toll of knowing that every landing was a potential death sentence was enormous. By April of 1945, the results of this combined arms strategy were undeniable. The once feared Me-262 threat had been effectively neutralized. While individual jets could still wreak havoc on a bomber formation, they could no longer operate with the freedom or in the numbers needed to alter the strategic course of the air war. The skies over the jet bases became a graveyard. Allied pilots would often find dozens of brand new, perfectly intact jets abandoned on airfields, hidden under camouflage netting, unable to fly due to a lack of fuel, spare parts, or pilots. The final combat sortie of a Me-262 was recorded on May 2, 1945, just days before the final surrender. The story of the rat catchers is a masterclass in tactical adaptation. It demonstrates a core principle of warfare, that no weapon, no matter how advanced, is invincible. The American pilots and their commanders faced a disruptive technology that threatened to undo years of hard-won aerial superiority. Instead of attempting to meet the threat on its own terms, by building a better jet, for which there was no time, they analyzed it, identified its inherent systemic weaknesses, and ruthlessly exploited them. The legend of the P-51 Mustang is often defined by its classic duels in the stratosphere, a thoroughbred fighter meeting its German counterparts in a test of pilot skill and aircraft performance. But the story of the rat catchers reveals a different, more brutal aspect of its character. Here, the Mustang was not a duelist. It was an assassin. It was a testament to the versatility of a design that could dominate a high-altitude dogfight one day and execute a precision, low-level ambush the next. The success of these missions rested entirely on the men in the cockpit. These pilots were a unique breed, possessing a combination of incredible patience, sharp observational skills, and a cold, calculated aggression. To orbit for an hour or more high above a German airfield required immense discipline. It meant resisting the temptation to engage other targets, to conserve fuel and ammunition for the one moment that mattered. Then, in an instant, that patience had to transform into a burst of focused violence. The dive from 20,000 feet was a masterclass in aerodynamics and gunnery. The pilot had to account for the incredible speed of his descent, the deflection required to hit a moving target, and the ground that was rushing up to meet him at a terrifying rate. All of this was done while flying through the thick, deadly storm of flak the Germans threw up in defense. Many pilots did not return. They were victims of the flak, or the treacherous low-altitude dogfights with the Focke-Wulf protection squadrons. Their sacrifice, however, was not in vain. Every jet destroyed on the approach to Lechfeld was one less weapon threatening the lives of 10 men in a B-17 over Berlin. It was a direct trade-off, a grim but necessary calculation in the brutal mathematics of total war. The campaign against the jets was a war within a war, a microcosm of the larger conflict. It pitted revolutionary technology against adaptive strategy, and ultimately, it was the strategy that won. The Me-262 was a glimpse into the future of aviation, a machine that was conceptually a generation ahead of its time. But it was a future that arrived too late, in too few numbers and with too many critical flaws to save the regime that created it. The rat-catching P-51 served as a brutal reminder that the effectiveness of a weapon is not determined by its specifications on paper, but by its ability to function within the chaotic, unforgiving ecosystem of the battlefield. The Germans had built a perfect predator for the high skies, but they had neglected to protect it in its own lair. This oversight, born of a focus on technological prowess over tactical reality, proved to be its undoing. The Allied pilots did not defeat the technology. They defeated the system that deployed it. They recognized that the chain of operations for a jet fighter, from takeoff to landing, refueling, and rearming, was a series of links, and the weakest link was the moment the machine returned to Earth. By relentlessly attacking that single point of failure, they caused the entire system to collapse. It was a victory not of brute force, but of intelligence, observation, and a willingness to rewrite the rulebook in the face of a new and deadly threat. The silver jets that had terrorized the bomber streams were ultimately grounded, not by a super weapon, but by the relentless courage and cunning of the men flying the piston engine fighters they were supposed to have made obsolete. In the final analysis, the story of the Me-262 versus the P-51 Mustang is a powerful parable about the nature of innovation in the warfare. It serves as a stark reminder that a technological leap forward does not guarantee victory. The German jet was a brilliant piece of engineering, a machine that rightly captured the imagination and fear of its opponents. Yet its operational history is one of what might have been. It was a weapon system introduced into a crumbling empire, a nation hemorrhaging resources, fuel, and experienced personnel. The Me-262 was a Formula One race car forced to compete in an off-road rally, where its exquisite performance in its ideal environment was rendered moot by the harsh realities of the terrain. The rat-catching tactics symbolize the ultimate triumph of adaptability over rigid technological determinism. While German engineers were looking to the future of supersonic flight, Allied pilots and tacticians were focused on the immediate, brutal realities of the present. They solved the problem in front of them with the tools they had, demonstrating that a well-flown P-51, guided by a clever and ruthless strategy, could defeat a technologically superior foe. It was a victory for the warrior over the weapon. Today, as we look back, the sleek, swept-wing form of the Messerschmitt 262 still looks futuristic, a symbol of a terrifying potential that was never fully realized. The P-51 Mustang, with its classic propeller and piston engine, seems a relic of a bygone era. Yet it was this relic that held the line, that found the chink in the armor of the future and struck a decisive blow. The legacy of the rat catchers is written in the clear skies over Germany in the spring of 1945, skies that allowed the Allied bombing campaign to complete its mission, paving the way for the final victory in Europe. It is a story of courage, of innovation born from desperation, and of the timeless military wisdom that understands that every giant, no matter how powerful, has a vulnerable heel. The hiss of the jet was the sound of the future, but the roar of the Mustang's Merlin engine was the sound of victory, of